Today I'm going to talk to you guys about narrative, level design, and specifically thinking a little bit about virtual reality because that's the area that I work in. And I know it's something that we don't necessarily talk about a lot when we're talking about game development, and especially when we're going in educations. And then when people jump into VR, it's like it's a whole new world, because it really is. It's a completely new world. So I just wanted to take some time to talk about like what principles from design and narrative design are the same for VR and which ones are different or sometimes even opposite, so that if you all ever venture into VR, which I highly recommend, even if it's just for a game jam or something like that, it's less, you're less likely to fall into common pitfalls, which we see a lot in people first getting started in VR, like making the same mistakes over and over, because we have so much ingrained in us from flat design. We call it flat gaming in the VR world. But yeah, so I wanted to make sure that I touched a little bit on that. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Linnea Harrison, and I currently work as the creative director at a VR studio called Neat Corporation. We publish and develop our own games. We're 12 people now, which is the biggest we've ever been. And when I joined, we were 3 people. And we make Budget Cuts and Budget Cuts 2, and we make a new early access game called Garden of the Sea, which is basically like Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing, Harvest Moon in VR. I just want to go a little bit over my career so everyone gets an overview, because everyone's journey into the industry is a little different. I actually started out with a background in simulation and training. Those were the first jobs that I had. So it was working with I'm American, so it was doing a lot of research with virtual reality back then. But the application purpose was for treating military members with PTSD. And for any of you who were at the Women in Games lunch on Wednesday, you remember me talking about that a little bit. But we also did some other simulations and stuff. And I got a real love for board game design and board game jamming. So I would do a lot of that in my free time. So I built board games. So eventually I realized that I really loved making games. So I brought myself to a school where I could study. I studied there for a couple years. I never finished my degree, much to the sadness of my parents, who live in the generation where college degrees are the most important thing in the world. But I got a job working on Call of Duty. So I worked on Call of Duty, Black Ops with zombies, Modern Warfare 3, Black Ops 2, and then I worked with Medal of Honor franchise, and then I switched over to Battlefield. After Battlefield, my dream job came along, and I got to work on Mirror's Edge Catalyst, the second Mirror's Edge game, because I was such a big fan of the first one. It was like what inspired me to become a game developer. I just absolutely loved how they used color and space, both from an artistic perspective, but also from a design perspective. And then I got to work on Star Wars, which was really fun, but I'm a Trekkie, so it was less fun than for people who are Star Wars nerds, I guess. But I got to work on the VR portion of that as well, because we did like a fighter, an X-Wing mission in VR, which was really fun, and that kind of rekindled my love for VR. And now that it was in the main space for consumer market, I decided I'm going to hop off and start working with VR full time, because it was super exciting. So I'm happy that I'm now at an indie studio for the first time ever. Been there for a few years now, and working with VR, which is always something new. Like, you think game development is always something new, and then you start working with like cutting edge hardware that changes with plugins every other week, and it's even crazier. It's fun and frustrating at the same time, but you're really, really proud when something actually works. So that's a little bit about me. I want to talk a little bit about video games and why I think they're important. Video games, I believe wholeheartly that we will never regret gaming, right? Anytime we spend gaming is not time that we ever look back on and say, that wasn't so fun. That wasn't so great. Like it's meaningful and enjoyable, and I don't think we will regret it in the long run, because games consistently, and this is like, when I'm talking about games, I'm talking about well-designed games, right? Well-designed games consistently provide us with the 4 ingredients that make for a happy and meaningful life. They provide us with satisfying work. They provide us with real hope for success. They provide us with strong social connections. And they provide us with the chance to become a part of something bigger than ourselves, right? We get these benefits from our real lives, but only sometimes and only in bits and pieces. But we play them, we get them every time we play a good game. And these benefits are what positive psychologists call intrinsic rewards. That is, like, they're inneboende. And these benefits aren't something that we do to play to make money or improve our social status or achieve like any signposts of success. We play these games for the internal feeling of goodness and wholeness, because we get satisfying work, hope for success, strong social connection, and a chance to be something bigger than ourselves, right? And not all games have all of those, but a lot of the really, really good games, the ones that stick with us and last with us, have a large number of those elements. And studies at the University of Pennsylvania, at Harvard, at UC Berkeley, they've all shown that these provide the foundation for optimal human experience. So it's no wonder that we really, really enjoy well-designed games that provide us with these intrinsic rewards. Playing games with kids and families is proven to create a stronger family bond and improve behavior in children. Playing video games together is proven to increase your trust in each other and enhance your relationships. Video games are proven to reduce stress and even prescribed as treatments for reducing depression and anxiety. Well-designed games are also proven to increase neural growth and to encourage creativity and problem solving, especially with young children. A lot of these elements become strengthened and heightened when we experience them in VR. But the feeling of immersion and belonging that VR hardware can lend also comes with greater risks of disengagement if certain design aspects are overlooked. Right? So, like, the stronger the likelihood to engage is, the bigger the risk is that we might alienate our audience. So if we look back at the beginning of commercial VR, there's been a lot of promises that the VR hardware manufacturers have been trying to deliver on, right? Lots of promises that they've made us. And that we as the developers have become really excited about, because we figured, the hardware developers, they know what they're talking about. They're the ones making VR, so they should know. But unfortunately, I think many of us kind of missed the point of what makes VR actually stand out, what actually makes it meaningful, and what the strengths are of VR. A lot of the hardware developers make these demos and do these big marketing pitches saying, like, you can finally sit together and play board games across large distances, like on other continents. You can see the effects of your decisions play out on the board in front of you. But I would argue that playing like this loses much of what makes sitting together and playing board games with your friends charming and interesting. That is the ability to see each other's faces. Like, that's literally the thing you cannot see and is covered in order to bluff or smirk or smile when making a decision or a strategic move. The limiting factors, therefore, of the hardware end up detracting from much of what makes this experience fun and enthralling, and misses the mark because of it. Hardware manufacturers have also said that VR is finally a place where you can connect with each other and feel what it's like to stand in another person's shoes. And while there definitely are some VR experiences that give you glimpses of these feelings and like a window into what this could be, but I think, again, they've sort of misled us. In a lot of the hardware demos and a lot of the marketing, they focus on interpersonal actions that forge connections, like eye contact, touch, and togetherness, like feeling really close to someone else, rather than the spatial experiences that bring us closer, like completing tasks together or facing struggle together or conveying information or empathy with another person or taking another person's perspective, or even something as simple as asymmetrical helpful tasks like you've got a wrench and I've got a hammer, and so you can do things that I can't do and I can do things that you can't do, right? So those are things that are spatially really strong and bring us closer, and are more aligned with the strengths of the hardware rather than, this eye contact stuff that they keep telling us to go for. VR hardware companies have set many of us up for failure, I think, when it comes to designing compelling experiences. And I'd like to talk about a few of those specific areas that I've discovered while building my first design for VR game budget cuts. So today, I'd like to begin by talking about context and the design of the game world. I then want to touch on the choices we make about how to present that world in VR and how pacing is affected by the immersive effect of VR. And finally, I want to talk about some unconventional approaches to fourth wall breaking and playfulness that I think are really unique to this early additional phase of VR hardware, which is why I encourage everyone to get in now because it's super fun right now. Hey, just gonna have some coffee. Recommend you all do too. Or, water is good too. All right. So when we're developing a game, we have two masters, the script and the system. On the one side, you have the plot, the characters, the vision of the creative director, the art director, the writers, etc. And like maybe if you're an indie developer, that's all you, but it's still the script and the story, right? And it has to be conveyed to the player, and it's a major part of selling all the complex games and systems to your audience. On the other side, you have the system, right? The hardware and the software running on that hardware, and all of the limitations that the hardware brings with it. This by itself is not inherently fun or engaging, right? Like when you look at this mapping of buttons, you're not like, ooh, yay, let me play around with this fun toy. No, it's how it interacts with the software that makes it fun and engaging and interesting. It's often off-putting and overwhelming, actually, to be presented, especially if you're presenting this. Like they say VR is something for everyone because all generations and non-gamers as well, because it's so intuitive with the movements that you make. And that is true. But if you give them these controllers, they're going to immediately start getting like, what are these buttons? What do I have to do? And then especially if you don't see those when you're in VR, if they just give you like a hand, you're like, I don't know where the buttons are on the controller and that sort of thing. So you're automatically alienating a huge expected target demographic for virtual reality, which is, it's a tough thing to balance and handle. So sitting between the story and the system is you, the designer. And it's your task to create a context and a gameplay which satisfies the needs of both of those. And some of you out there might be crying foul. Why would a designer worry about story so much? Isn't the gameplay the meaningful part of the medium? And in many ways, I agree with you, but I think a designer story provides the context in which you're going to be building your space. And that offloads a huge amount of teaching about choices, interactions, and mechanics that would be required in a context-less universe. Let's take any puzzle platformer, for instance. A lot of them take place on a planet that has gravity. And because you have that context, and like the character is like bipedal or quadruped, like has legs. So because of that story element, that context, which doesn't even need to be explained. It's just kind of obvious because of the art style and the direction and what you see in the world around you and what you see from the character. That the character will be able to walk and run and likely jump, and that there will be gravity that pulls them back down, that they can move in different directions, that sort of thing, right? So the context of the story makes a big impact on what the player's understanding of the mechanics are. And the more we're used to identifying genres by elements in the game world, which many of us as longtime gamers are used to doing, the more that offloading works and is really, really easy. The biggest difference I would say that virtual reality presents to a designer is in the creation of context. By having the player in an intuitive room-scale VR space, or even just immersed in 6 Degrees of Freedom VR, much of the context and systems are intrinsic. That is, they are the same rules that we normally have in the real world. For instance, moving your head left and right will turn your head in the game left and right. You don't have to teach them to turn it with the joystick. The same applies to crouching, reaching, and tilting, right? These are not now buttons and abstracted interactions that you have to teach the player. It's just how they normally move. So many movements and actions that would normally require explanations are now simply second nature. The context is also heavily helped by a feeling of physical presence in the world. And that creates an implied sense of belonging and immerses the player without much need for exposition on the game's part, right? Like, you don't need to do the whole big, the world is falling apart and it needs your help, and please won't you help us, and oh my god, it's the end of days and everyone's cares so much. Like, you don't need to do that anymore, or you don't need to do the whole intro sequence or cinematic sequence or anything like that, because if someone has taken the steps to put on the headset and the controllers, they've already overcome the greatest barrier for immersion and caring about this world. Once they are in that space, they themselves, their bodies are in that space, in that world. So the amount that you care is automatically so much higher than in flat gaming. So that's nice. But it can also be a downside. But usually it's very helpful. So sometimes when working in VR, context can actually be the downfall for interaction affordances. In the brilliant and awesome VR title, I Expect You to Die by Shell Games, the game is intended to be played seated in a chair. All the levels and missions are contextualized in a seated environment, or one in which being seated doesn't seem out of place. However, the context often detrimentally affects your expectations, like in the case of the car bomb level. So in this level, you're sitting in this car and you have to, I think, get away from the bomb that's about to go off. So you need to figure out a way to get the car out and away from this bomb. And in one of the sequences, you're supposed to grab something from the glove compartment. And how many of you out there have driven cars or drive cars? Not a lot. A few. Okay, about half. Okay, so you'll probably understand this. When you're grabbing something from the glove compartment, you're usually, I'm going to try to show what I mean. You're usually like, you lean on the middle, like, support to reach over with the other hand to grab something, because it's usually so far away. Sometimes you've got really long arms and you can just grab it like that, but usually you're going to need to like lean over to grab something from the glove compartment, and that's just kind of like a second nature movement that you get used to from being in the car, because you don't think about like, ooh, where can I put, where is stuff, what do I grab? It's just something that's become very like motor skill ingrained, right? And so they weren't expecting players to do this when they were in VR. And a lot of people were sitting in chairs that didn't have armrests or anything. So when they automatically leaned over to grab that something from the glove compartment, they thought they were going to get the support from the middle console in the car, because they thought they were in the car, which, you know, is great for immersion and storytelling. But here, a lot of people actually fell out of the chair and hurt themselves, like got bruises. Some people fell and hit their head on a table nearby. So it was really detrimental to a very significant portion of players in a very serious way. So in this way, context was kind of the Achilles heel of that experience, right? So a lot of this stuff we don't even think about when we're designing, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff that just gets built in, and we kind of have this gut feeling of what that is going to impact in the experience. But like, playtesting and actually paying more attention to how people interact in a context is so much more important in VR, because then you're going to catch these instances where you're like, shit, I never really thought about that, right? So, put another way, Story can be divided into two distinct components, context and plot, right? So we've been talking about context now a lot. And as a designer, you don't normally define the context at a high level, but you do build it, right? You are the one building the world. And as a designer, you don't write the plot, but you do fill in all of the details of the plot because you are, again, the one building the world, building the space where the gameplay takes place. And that inherently tells the story of the game. So each detail that you add or direct builds the context of the player's actions. And while mechanics that are chosen and interactions that are expected and gating methods used are all very explicit ways of incorporating narrative and context into the game experience, the backdrop is just as important as big cutscene moments or dialogue trees. And I think it's discussed far less often when talking about story in games. For instance, the world of Dark Souls is rich and immersive, not because of explicit storytelling, but rather through the environment and level design. I think it stands as possibly the best modern example of using traversal and challenge to pace narrative information. And it's a really good game to study for anyone out there who's considering a career in design. So all stories have a certain amount of information that needs to be conveyed in order for it to be considered complete. How this information is presented is not inherent to the story itself, right? Like fairy tales have been told through different media forms, in different ways, in different cultures for centuries. But the way the content of a story is presented is almost as important as the quality of the story itself. For instance, you could take all the events of Pulp Fiction and put the thing in order, telling the story of all these different characters in a linear chronology, but it would undermine much of what makes the film a classic. While the events in the film are not linear, the way they're presented is arranged so that you always have just enough information to understand the flow of the narrative. And then the editing elevates the story to be something truly special. How is this all related to game design, you might ask? If we're talking about like stories and movies and stuff? Well, games present a unique set of challenges and opportunities in how narrative is presented. We don't necessarily have total control over the flow or the environment in which the story is consumed, like a filmmaker does. This makes traditional storytelling inherently different from crafting a video game narrative, as we can't make any of these assumptions. In Beyond Two Souls, you have a good example of the challenges of mixing traditional storytelling techniques with the gameplay systems. The narrative is delivered such that mechanics change drastically between sections, and the player never has the opportunity to develop a sense of ownership over the experience, which sort of mirrors the story being told, which is part of what makes it really brilliant. So when we tell a story by embedding it in the world for players to participate in, we're actually shifting the balance of the narrative to be implicit rather than explicit. The narrative becomes distributed. The same is true with VR, but due to the grounded and immersive feeling the player gets, the focus on presentation of interactions and spatial experience is even more important than before. So I want to talk a little bit about the game Moss by Polyarch, which features this adorable mouse called Quill, who stole our hearts with the charming animations shown early on. And it's got this beautiful magical world which really comes to life. But I would argue that the decision of the designers here to have the player embody a forest spirit that controls Quill from a looming distance above the world with the controllers is exactly what distances the player and weakens the connection formed by the charming character and magical world, right? So like in this game, you are this big distant looming like spirit that's looking down into the world. And you are directly controlling the character Quill. And it kind of, it makes you feel like you're just playing a flat game, but you can kind of see into it a little bit better. It doesn't feel like you're actually in it and part of it. And it kind of makes you feel like separated from the experience because you're controlling Quill's actions directly. Nearly the exact same context is applied to Odd Raven's Carly and the Reaper Man game, which is built in Sweden. Fun fact. But here, the player in VR works together with a local co-op friend who is platforming, rather than controlling the platforming character themselves. And the experience, therefore, is entirely unique and really thrilling. Leveraging the strengths of spatial puzzle solving that VR has, which is what's being done here, the VR players placing platforms and building the stage for their friend who is actually platforming. And the classic fun of third-person platforming that traditional console games have. Each space is able to utilize its strengths to help the other and work together to a common goal, right? So they both have the same goal of getting Carly to the end of the level, but they each have different skills in order to do that. And what we know is that third-person platforming is a genre that's traditionally really strengthened by the console gaming world, right? Like it's always nicer to play with a controller. It's always nicer to play in that context rather than on WASD with mouse, right? Like it works, but it's nicer with a controller because that's kind of the world that genre has grown up in. And for VR, it's so much more fun to like move around and place things with your arms and like do a bunch of stuff rather than just stick with joystick controllers, which, you know, you could do in any old game, right? So it really takes advantages of the strengths of each of the hardwares and leaves them in their place and adds that cooperative element where each side has different strengths that they need to rely on in order to achieve their goals. So it works really, really well. So designers are the ones who craft the moment-to-moment storytelling, right? We talked about that a little bit. But when you're building a space, you really should have a story in mind, the experience that you want to create for the player. For example, in Alchemy Labs' game Virtual Reality, the art direction and context for the game were predetermined by the popular television show Rick and Morty. How many of you have seen Rick and Morty? Oh, I have. Okay. Far more than drive cars. It's an interesting statistic. But by being informed by the context with which the player takes on the role of the fumbling and often good-natured Morty, they're able to create one of the more immersive and emulative moments in VR. Not due to just the reliance on presence and physical belonging afforded by the headset, but by the types of actions that make the player feel panicked, fumbling, thrown in the deep end, and manipulated to create something potentially unethical for Rick out of context of his greater goals, which is exactly the role that Morty is given time and time again within the show. So in this example, for instance, you are playing, like in the VR game, you are playing as Morty, and Rick has asked you to charge this battery. And so you're working really, really hard to charge this battery, and it's this Bop It style game where you have to do these actions. Like when something lights up, you need to push the button. When this thing lights up, you need to swizzle it. You need to move it. You need to do all these movements, and it gets faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and harder and harder. So that kind of like emulates the fumbling, stressful anxiety that Morty tends to experience. And then when you're done with the battery, I don't remember exactly what he's using it for, but it's something like, oh, he needs to power this nuclear missile that's going to destroy this planet so he can get this mineral, but the planet is inhabited by a bunch of creatures. So you're like, oh shit, Rick, you really shouldn't do that, probably, maybe. So you like helped him in this big unethical scheme, which again kind of emulates the experience that you have in the film, in the TV series, which is pretty cool. So, more water. If we're looking at the level designer as a storyteller, I think it's important to identify the elements that make a complete story. And since most level stories are centered on clear, identifiable objectives, I don't think we need to go beyond the basic principles of drama for most high school English classes. If you boil these concepts down to the basics, you'll have the inciting incident, the rising action, the climactic moment, the resolution or denouement, and the reward at the end, called Freytag's pyramid. usually, or the hero's journey. You maybe have heard of those references before. And they're like cookie cutter basics for storytelling, right? But I think they work really well when we're talking about basic foundations for level design and for narrative design and for gameplay design as well. Because I think often they kind of go hand in hand, these human experiences of peaks and valleys. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, talking about story structure is all well and good, but how would you tie it into the design of a level in a tangible way? Well, if we're looking at the core building blocks of level structure, they might lay out something like this for most games, right? The objective in the beginning, a goal is placed before the player. You have obstacles, which form the rising action, something that stops the player from reaching your objective. Ramping difficulty, an increase in the challenge of the obstacle up to the climactic moment. Maybe that's a boss battle, but maybe it's just a combination of the mechanics up until this point in a really difficult way that you feel like really like an epic win when you accomplish that section. And then there's often a reward, right? That's the resolution denouement, the payoff for reaching the goal. So this basic cycle of challenges followed by rewards forms the basic loop of gaming, and each unit serves an important narrative function in the story the player is building, right? It's the player who's building the story. You're just providing the space for it. And the presentation of the objective that sets the player off on the journey introduces the important elements of the narrative. The obstacles form the rising action because now that the objective is clear, we have to overcome the challenges. And through ramping these, they result in this climactic moment that once passed allows the objective to be achieved and the reward granted. So this might seem like I'm overthinking it a lot for something as simple as like find the red key. But regardless of how basic the task is, all of the elements are needed for the player's story to feel complete, for their experience to feel meaningful. Objectives without obstacles or a proper climactic moment are often looked down upon as fetch quests that are done just to extract the tangible reward at the end and not for the richness of this experience. So I think each element is really important if you want to kind of avoid some of these pitfalls of really bland design. A good story is always asking and answering questions, keeping the audience engaged and interested. A well-paced game has a similar structure, presenting new objectives just as old ones are resolved, or hinting at bigger quests looming in the distance. If there's ever a time when the player has no questions or objectives in the world, then there's no longer a reason for them to proceed forward. This means that the game is sort of like a series of tiny stories, all building on top of each other to flesh out the overarching story of the game, creating a mosaic of narrative made up of all the game content and player experience. I also want to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of pacing. So this is from a perspective of the fight or flight type of pacing, not the tend and befriend type of pacing, because this is the type of pacing that differs the most when it comes to virtual reality. So the fundamentals of pacing can be broken down into three categories most easily. That's threat, tension, and tempo. So threat is like the actual danger. Threat can come in a lot of different forms, and each one has a completely different feeling of pacing. For example, combat tends to be really frantic and high-paced, while traversing an environment, even though the end result death, going across a really thin log over a ravine, right, could potentially occur in either situation. But they have very different feelings and different pacing. Tension is the perceived danger, your belief about danger. Tension occurs from the belief in an unknown danger and can be difficult to achieve, but the result of achieving it can be incredibly immersive. To achieve tension when you don't have the luxury of a well-known license to rely on, then you need to show the potential consequences of the threat in some form. Dead Space does a very good job of building up tension without the player immediately knowing what the threat is, because as soon as you board the Ishimura, it's really obvious that something's really wrong. Tension can also be achieved through a known threat. For instance, in stealth games, instead of a fear of the unknown, the tension comes from the fear of being discovered. Games like Metal Gear Solid and Splinter Cell or Thief utilize this fear well by forcing the player to engage in tense scenarios with enemies in close proximity. Tempo then describes the level of intensity of action, how much concentration is required by the player to achieve your goal. Low tempo gameplay is like serious thought and contemplation, like puzzles. High tempo gameplay is gameplay that requires fast reactions and split-second decisions. High tempo action often induces stress or panic, and it's often at its highest level called frantic. There's surefire ways of creating high tempo no matter what, like by imposing a time limit. That's usually like the cheapest way to do it, or what might be called forced pacing. Zombie encounters tend to be a bell curve of that type of pacing. Most encounters are, while boss fights tend to crescendo and increase the tempo continually. So it's really interesting to look at how the tempo changes with different types of encounters. So by mapping out the level of threat, tension, and tempo in each section of a game that relies on this fight or flight type of gameplay, you can easily kind of see how the curves are evolving through your game, and try to make sure that you're increasing overall your pacing, and that it's hitting in the right moments, in the right story moments, but that you're not like always at a high tempo, or that you're not always at a high threat, that you kind of like mix and match along the way. Okay, so we already talked about the structure of experience, that level design or game design is storytelling. And while we know the fundamentals of pacing are important, it's the way these fundamentals interact with each other, how they're structured, that's truly important. And the key to creating a well-paced level or game is to provide these moments of action interjected with calm, peaks and valleys, as they're often called. Keeping at a valley for too long can be tedious and lack excitement, while remaining at a peak for too long can desensitize the player to the action, to the point where it becomes repetitive and boring. But in order to properly understand just how deep-rooted our need for a well-structured pacing is, and like why it's important to understand this, I think it's important to talk a little bit about cognitive psychology. Okay, so this is a basic diagram of the mammalian human brain. In the front of the brain, we have the prefrontal cortex. The functions carried out by the prefrontal cortex area are called executive function. Executive function relates to abilities to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, determine good and bad, better and best, same and different, future consequences of current activities, working toward a defined goal, prediction of outcomes, expectation based on actions, social control, like suppressing urges. Basically everything that we think of as human is what happens in the prefrontal cortex. Then we have the limbic system, which controls the basic emotions like fear, pleasure, anger, and the drives like hunger, sex, dominance, and care of offspring. But in the center, we have the amygdala, not to be confused with the boss in Bloodborne. This is the alarm of the brain. It works like the connection board for mental and physical elements. If something scary is approaching, the amygdala sends signals to your legs and like pumps you with adrenaline to run away super, super fast, right? You don't often know what it is or what's going on. This just kind of, the alarm takes over and like shuts down everything else and gives you these primitive actions to do. The most important section to consider, though, is the cerebellum, which is that little thing sticking down into the neck, sort of, otherwise known as the lizard brain. It handles motor control, attention, regulation of fear, and pleasure responses, and it's also the oldest part of the brain, responsible for primitive survival instincts like aggression and fear. That's the fight or flight. Whereas the limbic system is responsible for, among other things, our emotional bonding to other creatures, other humans such as family members and friends. So the limbic system is more like the tend and befriend zone, whereas the cerebellum, the lizard brain, handles the fight or flight. So the window of tolerance is a term used to describe this area of like how scared you can be or how worried you can be, the mental arousal which a person is able to function in. When people are within the stress window of tolerance, are inside that, you're able to receive, process, and integrate information. and you're otherwise able to respond to the demands of everyday life without much difficulty. So when you're within their window of tolerance, you're generally functioning well, you can effectively process stimuli, and you're able to reflect, think rationally, make decisions calmly without feeling overwhelmed or withdrawn. However, when you experience stress, the prefrontal cortex region of the brain shuts down, in a manner of speaking, affecting the ability to think rationally and often leading to the development of feelings of dysregulation, which can take the form of chaotic responses or even overly rigid ones. In these periods, a person can be said to be outside the window of tolerance. So in gaming, this is like when people start button mashing because you're unable to process stimuli and respond in a rational manner, right? That's literally being outside the stress window of tolerance. It's not always as black and white as that, because the stress window of tolerance can affect things more than just button mashing. It can also be like emotionally overwhelmed, or it can be underwhelmed as well. It's not always going over the window. It's sometimes going under. When you're getting bored and you're like getting derailed, then you're not processing things properly, right? So there's this fight or flight or this freeze sort of mentality. And that's something that you kind of need to look for in players as the designer, to see, how are they responding to these areas that I've built? Are they within their window of tolerance? Do I want them to be within their window of tolerance? Sometimes you want to push them outside just so they can experience a bit of panic, because that's part of the story and the experience that you're giving them. And then you give them a period of calm to be inside the window of tolerance where they can like reflect, build a strategy, gather resources, and then go back out and be much more prepared. So most people move between these varying states all the time, from minute to minute and day to day. We experience stress, calm, elation, frustration, and a ton of other states that put us inside or outside our own personal window of tolerance. Interacting with the new environment in a 360-degree video, aka VR, triggers much more memory writing areas of the brain than does simply observing a familiar environment like a room in your home. This, to me, supports the old adage about memory, right? Like, we remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, and 80% of what we personally experience. So there's a lot that's going on inside your brain as it interacts with the world around you. Things like accessing old memories and simultaneously storing new ones, and responding to sensor input based on a primal understanding of cause and effect. And virtual reality taps into what your brain thinks it should be seeing and encourages it to fill in the gaps, much like you do with peripheral awareness. A lot of work is done on the development side with field of view, resolution, feedback, positional sound, and interactivity to simulate as many of these elements as they function in real life as closely as possible. Because of this, in VR, the pacing often needs to be dramatically reduced from a regular game's perspective, because every single element affects the player so much stronger due to the sense of presence and belonging. Tense moments become extremely stressful. Calm moments can be serene and emotional. And a sense of victory often feels like the biggest wash of endorphins you've ever felt in your body. It's tough to describe just how much stronger these feelings are in virtual reality, but the important thing to understand is that your pacing and elements of threat often don't need to be very strong or very dialed up in order for the player to feel motivated. So I want to talk a little bit about budget cuts that I've worked on and some of the elements there. I want to talk a little bit about locomotion. We solved this through portals and teleportation, but room scale and tracked VR headsets all allow a sense of space, a feeling of being within the world, which bridges the gap between our inner impetus to move, that is, like our inner desire to explore and move forward, and our external desire to move forward. As often as possible, we try to take advantage of traditional methods of motivating movement and engaging the player and exploration within budget cuts. We take notes from both classical games and communicate threatening areas and spatial options to the player as simply and as clearly as possible. The joy in this game comes from the feelings of immersion, of that marriage between the real-world haunted house feeling and the fantasy experience of virtual worlds. The advantages of using an intuitive locomotion technique combined with the immersive technology of room-scale VR often leads to quite intense and real moments within the game, which only serves to create even more memorable and meaningful experiences for the player, because again, spatial memory takes up such a larger portion of our brain and is considered much more important to our memory centers. But hilarity always ensues when we give these people who play our games fourth wall breaking moments, including this one, which is one of my favorites, when players are crawling inside roof panels, trying to peek down through one of the panels, only to discover that the real world floor does not, in fact, have a hole in it. So people will like hit their head on the floor trying to get a peek at the enemy that is under them in the virtual world. These moments where we actually heighten the player experience by reminding them that they are not in the virtual world of budget cuts is a really interesting and counterintuitive moment. And we try to capitalize on it during the designing of our game, because as many times as possible, we try to use real world skills and scenarios to break away from the norm of video games when it comes to how we present puzzles, how we indicate threat or safe spaces, how we allow the player and reward interaction, and how we imply tools and mechanics within the game. Playing off of this balance between the player and their immersion in the context of the game world is a really fun way to give the player those like aha light bulb moments and allow them to draw on inherent real world skills and techniques without slowing down progress or story with cumbersome explanations of systems. I think this is also like purely unique to the beginning of VR, because so many people when they're first playing in VR are amazed by how immersed they become and how quickly they forget that they're in the real world. And this is only something that's going to be available to us as designers in this early phase adoption of VR. And I say early phase adoption, I mean like the first 10 years. So we've already gone 5 years. So I would guess that we have like 5 to 8 more years where we have early adopters having these first experiences of being so immersed, and where the reminder that you are actually in the real world and it's actually different from what you see and experience is engaging and interesting. So I wanted to quickly talk about a concept called the dominant feature in games. It's usually the element that defines the piece of content you're trying to create, the central thread that weaves the whole work together. And it can be any form. It can be a character, a theme, a setting, a mechanic, but it has to be identifiable to both the designer and the player in order for it to be considered a dominant theme. Regardless of what the dominant feature is, it should be unique or used in a unique way in your content. The goal here is to create a memorable experience, and therefore it needs to stand out in some way, right? So classic Zelda dungeons are clear examples of this. A mechanic is worked into the fiction of the environment and forms the backbone of the player experience. All of the other elements are highlighting the possibilities of this mechanic. So if your users can uniquely identify your level as the swinging rope level or the nightmare rainstorm level, you have a good player-facing dominant feature. I emphasize the ability for the users to understand what the central element is in your content, because usually subtlety is not rewarded in gaming. The focus of a player is not on appreciating the beautiful scenery, but instead on playing the game. So if you have meaning that you're trying to convey through your design, it needs to be simple and clear and digestible to the player. That doesn't mean it needs to be dumbed down. It just needs to be focused and intense. To focus your design around the dominant feature, you need to use the dominant feature as a measuring stick to judge individual design decisions made throughout development. Every single prop, combat moment, lighting setup, etc. should somehow be connected to the dominant feature. By having the details of the design support a clear central design element, we put them to work conveying the intended experience. If you don't have them doing that, then these often feel like pointless areas that are just work, extra work. And you're like, why is this even here? In raw practical terms, it also acts as a good guide for scope and content. If a piece doesn't reinforce a dominant feature, it's a strong candidate to be cut or used elsewhere. Likewise, if an element is on the chopping block but would clearly enhance your dominant feature, you can make a clear case for keeping it. Once you have that central theme, you have to rally the rest of the content around that point, using the details of the design to support the dominant feature. So I wanted to take a look at a real world example, but I don't want to like take time by actually playing. I have like a clip of this mission. For those of you that have played Call of Duty 4, this is the mission called All Gillied Up. And if you've played that game, you remember this mission for sure. In this level, the player takes on the role of Captain Price on a stealth assassination mission. Every single detail of this level is designed to reinforce this fantasy of sneaking behind enemy lines in a ghillie suit with enemies always close at hand, right? That's the experience. Every single moment, every single element, every single piece that they've added to this level reinforces that experience. The level has a clear design focus and invests in that goal 100% to create one of the most memorable sequences in the entire campaign. Since VR is new for so many people, and a lot of people are just wanting to get in and explore the space and explore the hardware's capabilities, I strongly urge play, physics, physical interactions, and exploration to be strong components in whatever you're designing, right? Those should be strong themes. If you don't include these as the dominant themes in your VR games, a lot of first-time users will be left without that light bulb moment or that wonderful feeling of magic that VR gives people the first time that they eat a virtual donut and accidentally put a Vive controller in their mouth in the real world, which I totally did the first time I played this. As much as possible, try to have these elements and these types of interactions in the beginning of whatever experience or game you design in VR. Like, even if you're designing a more serious and linear narrative in VR, try to have the starting area have lots of physics objects, lots of playful things, because a lot of people are going to be getting in for the very first time, and you don't want to deny them that opportunity to play with the hardware, right? Due to the nature of this new hardware, exploration and curiosity tend to also be really strong motivators in the game initially. So taking advantage of that impulse and doing everything possible from a design perspective to not block the player's natural exploration of the system and the game world helps create a really smoothless transition into what's arguably the most intuitive of gaming spaces. So again, you don't need to do a bunch of this like, welcome to a world, you are this person and you must do this and blah, blah, blah. No, just give them some stuff to play around with, to knock over some stuff, and they will explore the space on their own. So if you can put that in as a meaningful part of the beginning of the experience, you'll be gold. So ultimately, designers build meaningful play through the details that they choose to include. Understanding the systems and the environment holistically is a key to crafting a compelling experience. The designer enables the creation of player story by determining what elements the story can and should contain. We humans are hardwired to this experience of peaks and valleys, of periods of stress and periods of calm, to being pushed and pulled through tempo, tension, and threat, which pulls us into a world to connect, to belong, toward a goal, and with a purpose. Thank you. Very silent clapping because I can't hear you, but I'm assuming.
So now we have everything up again.
Yay!
Yay! Oh
Thank you,
God.
everybody.
Thank you so much, Linnea. That was a lot of things to think about.
It's a lot.
So
I know. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, but it's amazing. Love it. People have.
I think this really should be like 5 presentations because it's so many different topics.
I am just so sad that we don't have more time to go through more stuff.
Well, I am always here on Discord, on Twitter. I have email. Feel free to reach out to me if y'all have more questions about this stuff.
Awesome. They are applauding in the chat also.
Yep. I'm not going anywhere. No worries.
I think since it's 1 hour have gone by, we have 1 hour left, we need to actually go straight into the assignment that we have for today.
Yes.
So I think we will take questions after the assignment is done. In worst case, we're gonna just email or we're gonna send questions to you, and then maybe you can answer them later on. So do you want to explain the assignment you have for everyone?
Yeah, so today we're doing a world gem. some of you maybe have done game jams before, but what we're doing today is a little mini world jam. And it's basically, it's something I came up with because I started feeling like, especially in game jams, and also when I was making smaller game projects, I was lacking a unique and different world and context to build the game within, to get inspiration. Like I kept falling back on the same ideas, like, oh, it's a dystopian future where everything's overgrown, or like, oh, it's a magical world where humans have I don't know, like there's elves and stuff, or like, oh, it's like the robots are taking over. Like it's always the same stories and the same themes popping up when I don't put effort into making them different. And I think it's something that a lot of us end up doing because we just want to get to making the game. We want to be like, oh, I've got this cool idea for this mechanic where you like spin around and slice stuff, and I want it to be like a dungeon crawler, blah, 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 right? So the World Jam is basically a way to help inspire you to create a world that's a bit different. So we're going to be doing it in teams, and hopefully by the end you will have the fundamentals or the grounding elements of a world, a culture, or a context that you can then take into your next game jam, or you can use this process for your next game jam to like come up with a nice world for that. So it's going to be nice little creative stuff.
Okay, yes. So I'm gonna fix the groups soon. I think we have a lot of people who are in the chat right now, or in the stream, who are actually here on site. Can you guys please go out of the stream so we can see who are actually here joining us online, so we can put you guys into groups, or into the groups we have.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Let's see. So we are shrinking here with a lot of people. Okay, so everyone who are in the video stream right now are people who are participating
digitally.
Digitally, yeah.
All right, cool.
We are a lot of people today. So fun, so nice.
Yay.
So we have one group up in EXD. I think Ia is gonna... Okay, Alex, I see that you have to leave soon. That's totally fine. The people up in EXD, I think Ia is gonna put you guys into one group. So that's you guys up there is gonna be one group. Down here, I'm just gonna do a 1, 2, 3, 4, and the first people in the we have 4 people up there. Great. So the first people I'm gonna put into the 1, 2, 3, 4 are gonna be like the team leaders, and I want you to gather your group later on, and I want the team leader to be able to fix a connection to the people who are online, so you can communicate with each other. Okay? Seems like we always do, kind of thing. So we can start here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Okay, so we have... Vad var du för någonting?
Jag har 3 då.
Då är det 2.
Nej, 4. Jag har 2, här var 1. Ja.
4, okej, perfekt. Great!
Det blir 4 då.
Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. So I would say that that are on distance. So I would say that Albin and Albin, if you want to join group number 1, you have access to the Goose Text 1 chat and the Goose Voice, and speak through there. And then let's see. I saw that Magnus, you can't really talk, but maybe you can chat through with Kevin, and then you guys join the group 2 in the Goose 2 Text and Goose 2 Voice. And then we have Thomas and Volt and Korpen. I think we're gonna put you 3 into the same group with other people, with group 3. So you have Goose 3 Text. We have some examples of how you can use it. How you can use the stuff we have here. And Linnea, do you want to go through describing the different points in the jam?
Yeah, so what we're going to do is after you form these groups and teams. Each group is going to get some starting cards for inspiration, right? And the starting card will be a geopolitical climate, a socioeconomic situation, and a technological state. So like how advanced. So those are like the limiting factors. But the inspirational factor is what I call a core fantasy. And core fantasies tend to be like the stuff you wanted to be as a kid when you grew up, like a firefighter or an archaeologist or an astronaut or a teacher, or that kind of stuff, right? So it's these like really core experiences that lots of humans, different types of humans, strive for various reasons, right? And so what you want to do with those core fantasies, once you get one, or maybe you'll get two, depending, is you want to break them down into like, okay, what if it's archaeology, for instance. I think I did an example here with archaeology. Yeah, archaeologist. What are the important elements that you believe in that are important to you if you're an archaeologist? What do archaeologists stand for and believe in, right? So they believe in pursuit of knowledge, the importance of history. They believe in truth and evidence. Seeing is believing. They value a sense of discovery and uncovering things. They like to share knowledge. They also have like this meticulous fine motor skills because they're uncovering really precious objects that are very delicate. So they have a lot of carefulness built into their work. But also just in terms of cross-referencing any of the information, they have to be extremely careful. There's also this like these ones at the top are definitely more like the stronger beliefs and driving motivations. These are like less strong, but you try to come up with as many as you can. So like naming things you discover, or being the first one to discover could be a motivation for someone if you want to be the first one to open up this tomb that's never been discovered before. Wow, oh my God. So that's your first step when you get these core fantasies, is to break those down. The second step is if you don't understand what's on the card, Google it and write it down, like do some research. So for instance, in this example, the socioeconomic situation was a period of plague. So there's plagues sweeping the world that you're creating right now. So it could be similar to this pandemic that we're experiencing right now. Wow. Technological state is near future, so just a bit more advanced than we currently are right now. So not like crazy sci-fi far future techno meditation stuff, but like similar to now, but a bit better. And then the geopolitical climate was binary superpowers. And you can kind of interpret that in any way you want, but the way I chose to interpret it for this was that there were two nations in this world that were of equal power. They had different different strengths, different resource strengths, but there were two binary superpowers in the world as governments, as nations, as people, as cultures, and they were sort of at war, kind of like in a Cold War sort of situation because of the plague. I figured that because of that, they kind of aren't focusing as much on killing each other, but rather on saving themselves. So there's kind of like this stalemate going on. So that's kind of like the first steps that you're going to go through. And then the second step you're going to go through is you can also reference all of this, and we'll go through each one again before we get there, so you don't have to remember all this. I know it's a lot. Is to identify like mechanics that you're going to be using as inspiration, or like mechanical moments or systemic moments. So for instance, in this example, I was going to do a game jam with VR. So I found any of the things in archaeology inspiration that could be VR related or like spatial interaction related. So like seeing is believing, VR works well with that, a sense of discovery, new hardware, meticulous fine motor skills, spatial accuracy, carefulness, care of relics. I was thinking like, okay, so maybe you're like actually physically taking care of relics and like physically uncovering things in VR, quite literally. And so these were the things that I wanted to then like highlight and focus on as my main themes. And so you kind of start developing out from there. It depends on what you're starting with and how you're going. Maybe you'll see different inspirations. This is the point where I also start like drawing and doodling a bit. So I don't have them on me, but I did like some stick figures of someone in a VR headset, like with a dinosaur bone, and like illustrating some of the mechanics out just to kind of get a sense of what the arsenal of gameplay is going to be there. And then also building out the world and like the story of the world, like what has brought it to this point, and stuff. So there's a bunch of questions that you can ask to help you kind of flesh out this world. So like, what are the daily fears and concerns of people living in this world? Like, what are their goals and their drives? What or who is standing against them from obtaining those goals? What are the biggest disagreements in the society about? How are these disagreements resolved, if ever? What led the world to be this way? Does the future of this world look bleak, or does it look hopeful? Is that from your perspective or from the perspective of someone in that world, So at the very end, what I want you to be able to do is to make this a little short video where you're presenting like, these are the starting cards that we got. This is the world that we came up with. So in this world, there's 2 nations that have been at war since forever, generations, and no one remembers why it started or whatever. You can be cliche if you want, or you can find something cool. And so like for me, the 2 nations were based on two different culture points. So one was archaeologists and one was technologists. So the archaeologists have more natural resources in their nation, and they value knowledge, discovery, care, history, etc. And the technologists are opposed to these concepts and believe in the now and the future, and are risk-loving when building technology. So they just like develop, build new stuff, build better. Progress is ultimate. But they don't have as much of a population because of the period of plague. They have a higher quality of living and longer life expectancy because of the technology, but they don't have as much population because they don't have the natural resources and stuff. So you can start to figure out like, what would these cultures do? What would you as a person do if this period of plague showed up? How does that affect the dynamic? What's going on? So like really building out these elements as much as possible. So I think we're going to start with handing out the cards, right?
Yes, we're going to hammer out the cards. I see that some people here are starting to get a little bit nervous because there's a lot of things happening. Yes. And we don't have that super much time. But I think Korpen said it really well. He said, have fun with it and don't sweat the details.
Yes.
It's really good to go into the nitty-gritty details, but it is, I think, the overall, like trying to get everything together. Like we are probably going to do this more than once.
Yeah, exactly. This is more about learning the process, because I imagine that if you get into game jams in the future, or you're starting a game project at school in the future, you'll probably do this again. Or you'll remember, you'll be like, oh, that was a really useful tool. Let's do this real quick. Takes like 30, 45 minutes maybe as a group. And then you can like start off your game jam by doing the little mini world jam, for instance. So this is more about learning the process, getting in the flow of things, being a little confused and asking questions in a space where we're here to answer them. Go for it. Go.
Go. Start.
Get our head into it.
Yeah.
Go make world.
Team leaders, go and pick your post-its.
Go have fun.
Here on the table. And gather your teams. I am very grateful for this opportunity. So thank you, Linnea, and thank you everyone else.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.